The 19th century saw a drive to reorganize the world economy on some new principles. Instead of the mercantilist empires pulling the parts of the world together, or tributary empires reaching into the hinterlands of Afro-Eurasia to pull subordinate polities into an alliance with dynastic empires, now what we see are a very different set of relationships emerging based on the flows of labor, capital, and commodities dictated by market forces, extolled by Marxists and liberals as free. That was the language of this new economic system. And it was a global economic system that was then in turn reinforced by a deepening industrial revolution, which intensified the process of specialization around the world. That, supported by this shift, I'm just recapping earlier lectures, a shift from organic to inorganic energy sources, the beginnings of factory production, the expansion of markets, thereby creating whole new frontiers, opening the way and opened by railroad expansion and credit expansion into the hinterlands. Now, markets were no longer local or coastal in the way that they had been in the earlier mercantilist age. Now they were penetrating deep into interiors. And after 1850, this is a process that kicks into higher gear. Why? Well, one of the things that begins to happen is we see a shift from what we might call the first industrial revolution to the second industrial revolution. That this expansion into the peripheries is buoyed by, in a sense, a second phase in the development of capitalism, the one that Marx was observing in transition without quite completely understanding it when he wrote the Communist Manifesto. A shift away from textiles and steam to iron and steel. By the 1870s, a technique had been discovered. These innovators that I've been talking about earlier figured out a way to puddle iron into steel, that removed the materials to make metal tougher, more resilient, and yet at the same time more flexible. Perfect for adapting to a new machine age. This was a system called the Bessemer technique. And it required huge blast furnaces for steelworks, rolling mills. And what was important from our perspective, since we've been talking about energy use, was now energy, because of the scale of these new steel plants, energy had to be brought to the production location. In the good old days, we located our production where the source of energy was. If it was wind, or especially water, we had to locate our mills and our plants adjacent to rivers. Now, especially thanks to railroads and canals, we could ship energy sources like coal to the plant itself. Oil, so coal, then oil, and then electricity gave much more flexibility to where we might locate these giant new plants. And with these giant new plants, we also have the movement away from a pattern of organization that relied on families creating enterprises, now increasingly to much more centralized pattern of ownership. So we go from family, small-scale, decentralized ownership of, say, textile plants and smaller mills, now to much more vertically integrated companies. By the late 19th century, the firms that we now take for granted, they dominate the corporate landscape, come into being. General Electric, Westinghouse, U.S. Steel, or what's left of U.S. Steel nowadays, in Germany, AEG and Siemens. the great zaibatsus of Japan and Russia's integrated corporations come into being in this age of the second industrial revolution, which of course begin the process of displacing those earlier archaic iron producers, especially the manufacturers of Great Britain, which could no longer compete with modern forms of steel. And so we begin to see the dramatic decline of the British share of world iron and steel manufacturing. As I mentioned earlier, this is one of the reasons for the, in a sense, relative decline in Britain's ability to compete with other manufacturing producers. Now, much of this process of innovation and the Industrial Revolution was in fact driven by, guess what? Well, what do you think might have driven the process of industrial evolution on this scale? Valeria, I'm going to put you on the hot spot here.
Well, I think maybe one of the reasons would have been wars.
Yeah, we've seen how guns like the Enfield rifle, and we actually saw earlier images of big cannon. Exactly, militarization was an important, and this is actually an old story. We know that so much of the scientific revolution in earlier ages was driven by military logistics. But the war needs in the 19th century motivated this quest for new kinds of techniques, especially with the Crimean War of the 1850s, the desire to make new kinds of weapons. Increasingly, the ability to take out your enemy depended as much on your ability to field new war machinery as it was on military tactics. And everybody could see the effects then that the Industrial Revolution was having on warfare. So Valeria, you're exactly right. It's about war. And one of the reasons why, let's just say we're planting a big seed right here, because there's going to be a relationship between, in a sense, the industrialization of war and what happens to a concept, another seed that we planted in earlier lectures, total warfare, and the ability for societies to wage wars of annihilation against each other. Once you harness the new second industrial techniques to what's happening. So now we see this new technology coming into being, but one of the side effects, always look out for side effects in history. It leads us into interesting detours. But one of the side effects of all of this is that while warfare was important for motivating a lot of this tinkering and innovating, it had an enormous implication for consumption, because so many of these innovations lent themselves for the creation of a whole new generation of consumer goods that people scarcely imagined existed before. Both consumer goods then and capital goods, right? The machinery that was required to go into the production process itself, this machinery itself had to be manufactured. So we see steel shipbuilding, construction machinery, the whole geography of industrialization as a result changes in the world. Industrialization, in fact, goes more global. As the United States, Germany, Russia, Japan themselves each become industrial nations competing with that first mover, industrial societies break out of that heartland of Great Britain. So suddenly we begin to see industrialization fanning out to the rest of the world. Let me just say that this is, in some respects, anticipates one of the things we're going to start to see in the 1960s and 1970s, just to jump forward a little bit, where we start to see industrialization in a new periphery, right? I'll come back to that later on in the course. So industries themselves move to other locations, and they change, therefore, the international division of labor, the role and the goals and the functioning of the competition between these core societies. And they also imply, thereby, a whole new set of demands for energy. coal and eventually petroleum would become very important inputs for this process. The result, the consequence of this, was an even more widening gulf that we saw in an incipient way earlier on in this course between urban industrial societies and rural agrarian ones. The gulf between the city and the country around the world grows, with vast pools of wealth being concentrated in the hands of these new industrial magnates, associated with these large, vertically integrated firms that will run coal extraction and oil all the way to the production of consumer goods that people had not imagined a generation earlier. Andrew Carnegie in steel, John D. Rockefeller in oil. These become the new economic titans of the age, in some senses starting the process of displacing those old mercantile elites that we talked about in an earlier lecture, like the Rothschilds and the Baring brothers. So already the Second Industrial Revolution begins to reshape the global capitalist class, again, to use a Marxian concept. Now, one of the effects, as I mentioned, of this mass production one of the effects of this transformation was the arrival of mass production. And a change in the way, with these new techniques and these new models of vertical corporate organization, the ways in which work was being conducted. Or, let's say, a deepening of a process that we've described earlier, an intensification of a process we've described earlier, which is about the division of labor. Here, in fact, this is a good image to look at because here is the quintessential artifact of the Second Industrial Revolution. People a generation earlier scarcely would have imagined that the automobile would be an everyday staple of social and private life that any aspiring member of the middle class might want to own. But why this image is also interesting for us is not just as an icon of this new pattern of consumption, but notice that the workers along the assembly line are all tasked with doing one thing. They're really specializing now in one element of the production process associated with the assembly line. And with specialization comes, of course, increasing productivity. This local division of labor within the factory itself then is an echo of what we are seeing around the world, which is an increasing international division of labor as entire societies become specialized producers in particular kinds of commodities. So the Second Industrial Revolution has some very profound consequences. It affects what gets produced, it affects how commodities get produced, and it affects where these commodities get produced. So let's ask ourselves, how did the transformation of the factory itself reflect, in a sense, what was happening already around the world?